Great. Well, hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to join you all here. I'm Assemblymember Alex Lee, and I'm joined with Senator Scott Wiener of San Francisco. I think we're getting some technical stuff set up right now, but we're happy to be here today to talk about my favorite topic, social housing. Is that right, Scott?
I know by far it's your favorite.
Okay. So, Senator Wiener, did you want to get us started, or you want me to just get into it, or how?
What? Yeah. So hi everyone. Scott Wiener, the honor of chairing the Senate Housing Committee in the California State Senate. I'm Senator Chang's counterpart. I want to thank him for his incredible leadership on housing, and it was great to be in Hawaii over the summer with Senator Chang and Senator Schatz and others. So thank you for having me. For those of you who are there, and yeah, why don't Assemblymember Alex Lee has been a true leader in California on social housing, and it's been a bit of an uphill battle. I think there's a lot of work to be done to expand or raise awareness about what social housing is and what it isn't, and sort of change some of the mindsets that have made it a little bit slow going in gaining momentum, but I know we'll be able to get it done. So, Assemblymember, thank you for your leadership, and why don't you make your remarks, and then we can take it from there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator Wiener. So I am Assemblymember Alex Lee. I represent California's 24th Assembly District in the California Bay Area in San Jose and Fremont, especially. I'm on all these committees, and this is also a great way to get hold of me. I'll have the slide at the end too. But for today's discussion, the most important thing is I'm the chair of the Select Committee on Social Housing, a topic that we have tried very hard to continue to bring to light. Let's go to the next slide. So you're probably, after hearing Senator Chang's discussion, you're probably going to hear a lot of similar things we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about it in the California context and why it's important about these things. But as you've already heard, there are a lot of great examples from across the world. This one is the Duxton at Pinnacle in Singapore, and it looks like very, very luxurious high-rise living, but in fact is 100% publicly built social housing in Singapore, in fact, which is a world leader, which we'll talk about soon. But I like to use this image because it can exemplify how beautiful and how impressive publicly built social housing can be, of course. And social housing is, of course, for all. So what is social housing? We're going to go into the next one. So, sorry. The first thing to talk about is, so how did I get upon this course of trying to bring social housing into the California context? Well, actually, when I was running in 2020, I knew that the housing crisis was the top concern for my constituency and, of course, the entire state, and growingly so across the nation. In my home city of San Jose, in my own zip code area, the average home is selling for a single family home is selling for about $1.3 million. San Jose remains one of the most unaffordable places to rent and live in the entire country. And there certainly needs to be more solutions at the fold for when it comes to housing. And I realized that we are missing a crucial tool that many other countries are doing, or many other countries have. And why I bring up this white paper that we see in front of us was that I was sworn in December 2020. In February 21, East Bay for Everyone, which is a constituency group actually in my area as well, came out with a case for a public sector housing developer called the California Housing Corporation, which in many ways inspired the work we did. It's actually a great read. It's one of the few pieces that are social housing California centric. So if you're also interested in the California context, this is a great illustration, an example of it. But this is really pivotal in going down a journey since my very first days in office. So let's go to the next one. So what is social housing? I think we've also, of course, heard about a lot of this during today's presentations, but social housing fundamentally is how we can realize housing as a human right. It is a paradigm shift in making sure that we have the public sector deeply engaged in the creation and provision of affordable housing across many income levels. It's a paradigm shift that we hope in California will lead, but we know for our partners in Hawaii and many other states I'm going to talk about in a bit, we're all in a race to do this at scale and at mass. So let's go to the next one. So something very important, though, and I want to stress about is that social housing ought to be for everyone. And you've heard these points stressed today too by Senator Chang and some other folks, and why mixed income is important, but also important to realize this philosophy of universal benefits. Many other countries in the world stress this idea that, when they build public goods, it's for everyone. We don't, for even in the American context, we don't put income gates when people go to libraries, or we don't income check people when they go to the park. We make it so these are universal public goods available to everyone, because we know if you're a super mega billionaire, you have your own private vineyards to go stroll in, you have your own private libraries to go towards. But the idea is that it's inclusive for everyone. And just as it is so that in California and in America, we have this expectation that a government provides these universal services and goods, we should also extend it to housing. One often example I use is when it comes to education. When it comes to education in California, there is no explicit guarantee that every child will be educated. And yet, every parent in California understands the moment their child is born that they will go to school. It could be a private school, could be a charter school, could be homeschool, but by and large, most people go to public school. It is a social expectation that school districts will build and hire enough teachers if there was a surge in new students. And of course, the opposite is unfortunately true too, if there is a decline in students as well. But there's an expectation that the public sector, the school, takes it upon themselves to go provide the infrastructure. But when it comes to housing, and our constituency is clamoring at city councils or state leaders to do something about the unavailability of affordable housing, the cities often, rightly so, say it's not our job to do that. We can't do anything about it. There is no public sector capacity to provide housing on their own, even though many countries in the world have this tool to supplement, of course, the private market activities too. And so that's why it's important to emphasize that these goods, especially for social housing, ought to be for everyone. It shouldn't be relegated to those who are very, very rich or those who are just very, very poor. It should be for everyone. And that amount of mixed income communities is not just socially desirable, but also financially sustainable over the long term. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more. Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide now. And I'm going to talk about very briefly here about what is the 5 ingredients of successful social housing policy. And this can be applied philosophically to any layer of government, whether it be federal, local, municipal, anyone. If you wanted to take it upon yourself to be a public sector social housing developer, these are the 5 kind of ingredients from a basic policy making standpoint. So with many policymakers on here, you're wondering how do you get started? What are the elements? Here are the 5 elements I think are essential to creating an actual social housing policy. So of course, number 1, you need to have money. You need to have financing. In Montgomery County, they talked about their own revolving loan. They have their own financial capability that is not so dependent on the whims of the market. That's so important. But there are other options out there. Vienna has a 1% employee 1% income/employer tax that they combine for their housing needs. Although it's a caveat, it's been 100 years old and it's not enough to build for everything. But there's lots of different methods out there. You could also use property transfer taxes, anything like that, or just your regular general fund financing. Just got to have some money. 2, very important too, is to have public sector developer expertise. You need to have people within the public sector. This could be a city, again, this could be a county, or even a state, that you have to have people who understand how to develop residential property. That is so, so important. At the state level, we have a lot of great experts who know how to build offices, to build parking lots, to build warehouses, to build everything. But the moment it starts becoming residential, we have this breakdown of this mental block where people suddenly say it's no longer a job. But we have the capacity to build 4 walls and plumbing. All that stuff is still there. It's still important to have. And notably, too, it's important to have it within house and not just be contracted out for sake of efficiency and cost, too. You need to have policies that, of course, also input residents, people that will live in social housing, and people, of course, in the community, too, because that's really important to make sure that residents have a voice in what they say. And this happens even in the Singaporean model, where people who live in social housing in Singapore have what's called basically town councils, and they participate in the maintenance, upkeep, and all the event planning that happens. And then, of course, and fourthly, you need land banking. You need the ability to cobble together parcels of property in order to build on, because you can't build it in the middle of the air. You have to build it on land. And lastly, the most important one that I would say almost every American government has these 4 already in some fashion, probably completely independent from one another. But put together all four of them with the fifth element, which is the philosophy, you have the ingredients for social housing successful policy and program. You need to have the philosophy that is the government's role to ensure that everyone has a home. It is the government's role to be part of that. It might not be the sole party responsible for that, but it has to have a strong role. For the most part, in the American system, we have relegated the entire provision of housing to the private market. For better or for worse, that is the model we have. That is not the model for many other countries, but we need to make sure that the government has a strong role in that and it has that philosophy. When you mix these 5 ingredients together, you get your social housing program. And you can do that as, again, a city, county, even state level. You just need to have these 5. Of course, everything layered on top that we're going to talk about later that has the extra flavors basically is important too, but these are the essential core parts that every social housing program successful in the world and our own country has. So let's go to the next one. So now I'm going to talk about 2 of the very famous examples internationally, which we already heard a bit about, but I'm going to give you some context of why it's important in the California context. So in Vienna, a very famous European example, they started their social housing era during what's called the Red Vienna period, which is when right after the conclusion of World War I, where the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was defeated and the entire empire was broken up, Vienna, which was formerly the imperial capital, had to take it upon themselves to figure out, one, how to create a republican form of government and democracy, and also provide for very basic human needs. One of those very central needs was housing. At the start of the Red Vienna period, nearly a quarter of the population were housing insecure. So bad that, of course, people are living on the streets, but also renting bed space from one another in almost phases. It is so bad that actually, can you go back real quick? I haven't finished on it. It was so bad that the Social Democrats who came into power, the left-wing party, made it a central provision of their government to provide housing. This is one of my favorite political posters of all time. And it basically says, the red man says, and there are 3 piles of housing. If you can see here, the smallest pile all the way to the left, it says, this is what I promised. The middle pile, slightly larger, is this is what I delivered. And the larger pile that he's still pointing to is this is what I am yet to accomplish. So the provision and supply of housing was crucial to their governing rule. And they were actually able to accomplish that too. This is why today in 2023, Vienna ranks amongst the most livable city in the world, and this is by The Economist too. And New York Times recently did an expose on what Vienna's social housing program is like, and they call it the Renters Utopia for a really good reason. Okay, let's go to the next one. It's called Renters Utopia for a really strong reason, is because 62% of its residents of the entire city state live in social housing, and 75% of all people qualify. And why is it a utopia in so many regards too? Is that in Vienna, in the Viennese system, you only ever get rent, you only get eligibility checked one time, and that's upon signing your lease. So as long as you can pay for your lease and live in that location, you can graduate in wealth, you can graduate in social status, but that's something that is accepted, and you have a really strong stability too. You also have what's called an indefinite lease, meaning you only sign your lease ever once. There's no year-to-year term. There's not those things. This is, of course, now in the modern world, there are limited length duration leases that exist in the world, in the city, because that exists nowadays. So anyways, just to give you a context of social housing in Vienna, that so many people live in social housing. And in contrast too, now is a different example you've also heard about. If we go to the next slide. In contrast to a different political end of the spectrum is Singapore. Singapore consistently ranks #1 on the World Heritage Foundation as for its economic freedom index from a very conservative think tank. It is a very capitalist system, and in many ways, if we look at it socially, it is a very more right-leaning system. But it was the founding principle and dream of the founding prime minister that they would go from mud flats, which is basically imagine hovels, to a true metropolis. And let's go to the next slide. And in less than 100 years, they were able to accomplish many of the things that Senator Chang was talking about. Now, some of the things you already heard about, 80% of all its 5.5 million people live in social housing, 90% of those people are homeowners. They're homeowners within the social housing scheme, and they have built 1.2 million units across 24 towns. And now why they call them towns is because they're self-contained towns almost, but vertically. This picture here you see is actually one of the first kinds of housing where it's integrated senior housing with a medical facility. So the senior housing is those flats looking up there. The black windows, glass, is a medical center, hospital. And below that, you have food court. Below that, you have shops. And there's transportation integration too. So it's very important to them to also have this robust social ecosystem. But yes, two contrasting examples of international really high standards. So let's go next one. And here's some examples across the United States. You heard today earlier from Montgomery County, which is doing some amazing work for the Housing Opportunities Commission, so I won't belabor that point. But we are in a race right now to achieve social housing in scale across many states. And let's go to the next one, just so we illustrate some of the examples. Again, you heard about the great successes of Montgomery County, and they're providing a lot of affordable housing with their model. But in California, more locally, we have what's called the Capital Area Development Authority. In Sunrisa, this 57-unit complex that is 100% affordable for people who are formerly unhoused, sits minutes away from walking distance from the Capitol. In fact, it uses what's called the ground lease program, a ground lease program from the state. So this is state property, but a different entity comes in and develops at it with a virtually low to no costs for the land. CADA, C-A-D-A, in this context, though, is another public entity, but oftentimes the ground lease scheme can be used by other private entities as well. And of course, great shout out to Seattle is that voters approved for the first time in American history a social housing developer in February 2023. The folks behind initiative I-135 are actually in the midst of right now putting together the social housing developer. So we're going to be watched with a lot of excitement to see how they go through this. But in many ways, their work has similarities to bills that I've worked on in the past too. So now we're going to talk about some of the bills, some of the efforts in California. So we have notably, of course, the Select Committee on Social Housing, which informs public and legislators about social housing in general. But two bills I want to point your attention to is in 2022, we had AB 2053, which would have created the California Housing Authority. Now, this has a lot more similarities with the Seattle model because it created a whole new public sector developer that could have produced and acquired social housing, and it was able to issue bonds for its own financing needs. This bill, unfortunately, made it quite far into the Senate with a lot of help and leadership from Senator Wiener in both of these efforts, but it unfortunately did not pass out of that second house in 22. But in 2023, we came back with second version. Just to note, we did start with the California Housing Authority type bill in 23, but in the end, through compromise, we created what's you could call a demonstration project using what's called the excess sites program. And this would have operated as a ground lease program. It would have formalized for the first time a land bank, but it basically would have used the state property. Senator Chang also talked about this too. The state of California owns a lot of properties. Oftentimes these are warehouses or old offices where no one lives, but they could be very central urban locations. And these are great places to develop mixed income social housing at little to no displacement risk and also little to no costs when it comes to the ground. And this program envisioned that we would take 3 parcels of state property and ground lease them to another entity. Now that, of course, it could be like CADA, another public entity, or sometimes universities that are doing this, or it could be another private entity, say a nonprofit developer or even a complete private developer, typically, and they could develop social housing on those sites. This bill got all the way out of the state legislature, but unfortunately was vetoed at the very last weekend. So we continue to work on this, but it made it a lot of ways through. But to give heart to our efforts is that AB 309 this last year passed both houses legislature 2/3 majorities and was really well received. And again, I have to thank a lot of partnership with a lot of our co-leads and co-authors, including Senator Wiener. So that's the only reason we got as far. And then I think we have one more slide. Yes, and this is just to highlight, and you've heard ad nauseum a lot of the reasons why, but I want to point to you why it's important. 2 reasons. That mixed income social housing is really important for its long-term financial health as well. We want to make sure that residents there are not completely cordoned off and warehoused to be poor, or completely income segregated too. But making sure that folks using different levels of incomes are able to maintain those properties and pay off the property too in a more holistic fashion. But we also need more tools in the toolbox when it comes to addressing our housing crisis. Right now, right now, to meet our housing goals by the next decade, 2030, we would need to build annually 310,000 housing units a year. Right now, in the 2018-22 period, annually, we're only building 85,000 units. This is in better conditions. It's not a great ideal conditions, but this is also in the modern era where California has taken more active lead in passing pro-housing policies. We still have a huge gap, a huge delta to fill, and we need all the solutions possible to fill that gap. And if we were to do that, we need to also have social housing developer, a public sector developer on the table as well to produce housing. And we know that we have resources and advantages in our capacity. We have the state land, which we already know there are suitable developable parcels in California. We have scalable, cheap financing that's possible for us. We can also cobble together the public sector developer expertise to get this done. So without all of these tools, we could not hopefully be able, might not be able to reach these goals. And that's why it's so important. And that's why I show this big gap right here. Okay, I think that is it. Okay, just to reiterate one more time, social housing is for everyone. We need to make sure that for political reasons, for financial reasons, and social reasons, that social housing is allowed to be for everyone of all walks of life to live together. And so they're making sure that any excess profits or any excess revenue that comes in can be reinvested back into the community rather than private interest or a private landlord. This is my contact information for my chief of staff who works very closely with me on social housing. You can get Allison by email or phone, or just go to my website. But I think we're going to go into doing Q&A in a second. But thank you so much for having me on the Rise of Social Housing online conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Assemblymember, for your work. I was going to ask you a few questions, but I think we're running a little behind. So perhaps we should just open it up to questions from attendees. So I think my staff is going to send me any questions, so I'll be on the lookout. If there are not, okay, here's a question. So, and this was going to be one of the questions I was going to ask, so great minds think alike. So how would you respond to critics who cite previous failures in public housing in the US as reasons why we shouldn't support social housing? I know you've talked about some of this with this is more mixed income, et cetera, but if you could respond to that specific issue that we know that people sometimes raise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people have a lot of validity to being skeptical about public housing because of our track record in this country. Senator Chang talked about how over time it was disinvested in, defunded, and really sabotaged over time. But I would say that a lot of the failures and people have such vivid memories of is because the government actively did not make it successful. But also at the same time, it was always reliant on extra subsidy from outside. The social housing model, which has also been successful for almost a century in many different contexts. In Vienna's case, over 100 years. In Singapore's case, getting close to 100 years. It can work in so many other places, and that's why it's important I illustrate with examples from across the world I've been doing for a long time. But we can also learn from their successes, but also learn from our mistakes in this own country, and we can make a really great public sector developer social housing program in this country. And that's what I would say about that is like we have the capacity to learn from successes and the capacity to learn from mistakes of our own.
Let me see if I don't see any other questions, so I'll just ask a question because I can always think of questions. So one second, I wrote it down here. And you touch on this a little bit, but in terms of like, I've noticed in our process. By the way, my shirt is very shimmery on the video, so I apologize for that. I shouldn't wear pattern shirts, I guess. It does look good in person. I promise you that.
I'm sure it does.
So in terms of, there is some tension with the sort of more traditional affordable housing community and the folks who, obviously who could view this as a competition for resources and so forth. How what's your approach to trying to navigate that tension?
Yeah, understandably, there's this natural idea that people might be fearful that there is a displacement in the sense of work, but to show how dire the need of how our housing supply really is, and that's why I use that graph saying we're only building 85,000 units a year, and we need to be doing really 310,000 units a year, 310,000 units a year, is that we really need everyone rowing together as fast as possible, and having more tools at our disposal with the social housing developer can complement a lot of the work that nonprofit developers do. To be clear, I don't foresee in any sense that nonprofit developers are their pivotal and crucial role to disappear anytime soon. They still have an immense amount of work we have to all do together, and especially with specialized communities and those in need of especially supportive housing. I think there's a lot of great need there, and I think we still have a long time to go together. When it comes to the resources part, I think there's a lot of resources, frankly, to go around if we were ever successful Senator Wiener in passing a more dedicated funding stream for housing overall. I think we would readily say there should be housing money for everyone altogether, and not just pick, say, hey, this person gets all the money. We'd probably do all that together, but I think that's also on the horizon. So I think really that having more people fulfilling the same mission is a good thing, because at the end of the day, there is way more work than any one sector can do on its own.
Great. So another question, do you have any advice for individuals or grassroots organizations who want to persuade local governments to implement social housing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there actually are some cities that are trying to actually create their own public sector developer. Of course, Montgomery County being one of the most successful examples in America's county, of course. So I would point them to examples like Montgomery County or other places. I think they're very smart about how to do things, and you can show the successes. But I think one thing that's really important is to always illustrate this point as the intention with local electeds, and sometimes often they don't realize this too, is that truthfully, a lot of local electeds, when people complain to them that they need more housing, they say, I can't, I don't build housing. This is true. So why should we not change that equation so that they have the ability to produce some housing? I think that's very, very integral to that. And if a county wants more tools at its immediate disposal to actually have the ability to produce housing, this is one of those great things. But I would say using that philosophy idea is saying, hey, you should have the power to actually build more supply is incredible. But the second time, pointing to some successes, even in this country, are actually probably really illustrative. And, something that could also be done at the local levels is to ask your council or your whatever body is the staff there to actually just look at these examples and say, hey, is this something to study? How can we apply it to our local context too? I think it's important.
Okay, great. I'm being told that will be our last question. So thank you so much, Assemblymember, for your work. And thank you to Senator Chang as well for his incredible work in Hawaii, for always working to build and cultivate these interstate collaborations. So the next presentation is today at 11:30 a.m. Hawaii time, because it's not 11:35 in California, but it is in Hawaii. And that presentation is entitled "A Rural County Builds Social Housing," with Director Adam Riverside and Senator Troy Hashimoto. Hi, Senator. Good to see you again. And thank you to everyone for being here and for having us Californians today. Thank you.
Thank you.